Welcome back to Insight Review as we look back on the defining stories of the past 7 days. Qatar has become increasingly isolated following a diplomatic row with Saudi Arabia and its Gulf allies. The tiny but influential Gulf state has been accused of backing extremist groups and of becoming over-friendly with its neighbour Iran. And that has led to Riyadh closing its airspace to Qatar's national airline. Egypt, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates have also severed relations with Doha. This week, Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has denounced the isolation of Qatar as inhumane and against Islamic values. TRT World's Nicole Johnson has more.
Saudi Arabia has taken the diplomatic lead in its offensive against Qatar. The Saudi Foreign Minister met US Secretary of State Rex Tillerson in Washington and justified his country's decision to close its border with Qatar. The visit came a day after Qatar's foreign minister was in Paris. He met the French president to try to get major oil and gas trading partners in Europe on his side. It shuttled diplomacy at an international level. As for Turkey, its president Recep Tayyip Erdogan has called Saudi Arabia's blockade inhumane and against Islamic values.
It's as if a death penalty decision has been taken for Qatar. The country has been choked by cutting down their food, medicine, whatever you can think of, even closing down the airspace for them.
Meanwhile, in Doha, supermarket shelves are filling up with Turkish and Iranian products. They've been airlifted in since Saudi Arabia closed its border. Qatar says there are no food shortages.
Still with me on today's programme, the journalist Nicola Hill. Also here, the lawyer and broadcaster Andrew Kidd. Well, when this happened, when Saudi declared its hand on what it intends to do against the state of Qatar, who saw that coming?
Well, very few people, I would have thought. Only a month ago, Trump was at the summit in Riyadh that was hailed as a huge success for the region. And we've gone from that to this in a very short period of time.
It's interesting that we're getting conflicting messages from America, involving with this. I mean, Trump has tweeted supporting Saudi, but then they've just done this deal. Is it $12 billion? They've
selling
the jets
to Qatar, yes.
So we're getting mixed messages for what America thinks about it.
Yeah, and I don't think there's necessarily consistency in the American messages and the messages coming out of Riyadh about the earlier meeting with Trump and the Saudi royal family. The Americans came away saying they'd done these billion-dollar deals on weapons and so on. Saudis haven't quite confirmed that, but it seems to have emboldened them. They're back in favour with the Americans. Let's start pushing our neighbours.
I thought what was very interesting was again, we go back to social media, you go to Twitter, and somebody has tweeted, "Thank you, Turkey, for the milk," and they've tweeted a photograph of the bottles of milk. It looks great, but it's a serious situation. I mean, the fact there is this blockade, and there are, they say there's not food shortages, but if this continues, what will happen in future?
But Qatar is a staunch ally of the US. It's been a friend to them in the war on terror, alongside them in the military strikes against ISIS. So I think Trump has backpedaled somewhat from the earlier position of distancing himself from Qatar to now being more of an ally.
Oh, yes, I mean, America's always had to deal with this. It's Middle Eastern allies and their different representations on the ground and who their friends are and who their enemies are. Because there's a US Air Force base in Qatar, the biggest one in the region. That's where they fly all their flights out to over Syria from. So there's no question, I think, of the US severing its ties with Qatar or joining the crowds railing against them. But if we look at what Qatar's been up to recently, they've backed groups in Libya, which were seen as anti-Gaddafi, so therefore no one really minded about that too much. Egypt, that's the Muslim Brotherhood. Syria, different groups than the Saudis approve of. And of course, Hamas in Gaza, which is another moot point, because the Americans, of course, are allergic to Hamas, rightly or wrongly. So these divisions were bound to expose themselves at some point, and we've got Iran in the background, which Qatar has to be friends with because they share the same gas fields.
I heard a very interesting report this week that apparently top Hamas people living in Doha have left because they realise it's putting Qatar in a difficult situation. So, as you say, the implications of what's happening in the Gaza Strip, the amount of money that Qatar has spent on housing, building in the Gaza Strip, will that continue? We don't know.
And it's international profile. We've still got a World Cup to look forward to. I don't know quite how that's going to go. Things need to resolve themselves before then, one supposes, or there'll be a lot of teams not being sent by their by their countries.
It's 5 years' time, isn't it? I mean, that's 2022, the World Cup, so hopefully in
happen.
5 years, things, we all hope in 5 weeks, 5 days,
Yes.
it's going to sort of improve the situation at the moment, but we don't know.
Indeed, well, we watch and wait, and of course, as usual, the Middle East remains unpredictable, both from the outside and the inside. Just a few years ago, Microsoft founder Bill Gates said that polio could be eradicated by as early as 2019, following the success of his foundation's vaccine program. But in the past fortnight, however, the billionaire philanthropist may have had to rethink his predictions following 2 outbreaks of the deadly disease, one in the Democratic Republic of Congo and another in Syria. Both outbreaks come from areas with poor vaccine coverage. Well, this is certainly thrown back. We've always imagined, haven't we, that since the days of the 50s and 60s, that things like polio and smallpox were going to be consigned to the past, never darken our hospitals again, and yet, as soon as we turn something of a blind eye, even for a moment, these viruses seem to turn up again.
There was hope that, in fact, by this year they were going to achieve, that aim, that by 2017, it would be eradicated. The problem is, polio is a virus. You have the oral vaccination that we're all aware of. You have it on a sugar cube. That actually gets into the system, gets into the intestines, and it stops the virus hitting the nervous system, stops paralysis. That's great. Unfortunately, in areas of great deprivation, there's not enough people being vaccinated. You need herd immunity. And certainly in the Democratic Republic of Congo, apparently only 1 in 5 children are being vaccinated.
Is that because of accessibility to these remote areas, or,
I think
or cultural differences? I mean, why is it that they can't get to everyone?
In Congo, it's not cultural difficulties. I think it is accessibility. Right. You then have the problem that if you've got poor sanitation, and this is what they're thinking has happened in this case. They think these are a type of vaccine-caused polio. It's a weaker polio. It's a weaker type of the disease. If you've got poor sanitation and you have the disease is spread in that way through fecal matter. So if it gets into the water system, that's how it's spread. That's why there is fear that it could spread a bit further. But it has happened in the past. And the best thing to do now, and you have got the Bill Gates Foundation, you've got lots of people who are determined to eradicate polio, is to just get out there and keep vaccinating. And it's then persuading people that this might be caused by the vaccine, but it's still safer for everyone to be vaccinated. That's the best thing. It's a very weak form of the disease.
And I think it's also a timely reminder of the importance of foreign aid, because I was reading that Washington's 1% foreign aid budget, some of that is allocated to fights and causes such as this. And when foreign aid is under the spotlight and people are questioning it, particularly here, I think it's just a timely reminder that
and that's an interesting point, because you say malaria and people go, oh, that's something that happens over there. But if you say polio or smallpox, people think, oh, no, we remember that. And it's a reminder, isn't it, to the world community that everyone's in that game, that everyone's got to be involved in making sure that these things stay under control. Is the virus there all the time, floating around? People always think of the eradication of polio, suggest that maybe the virus could be killed off forever, but that's not necessarily how it works.
But that's the aim is, I mean, there's 3 different types of viruses with polio. I mean, this is one of the things that you have to understand as well. One of the strains has been eradicated completely. So they're now fighting against 2 of them, which the oral vaccination has. And they're hoping that eventually, if you can eradicate it with the oral vaccination, then you do have an intravenous. In other words, it's a jab. You can have a jab. And the aim is to completely eradicate it, to wipe the virus off the face of the earth, which is what's happened with smallpox. I mean, they decided in '67 they wanted to eradicate smallpox. By 1980, it was gone.
It's a bonus that billionaires in their philanthropic projects take such an interest in health.
Absolutely it is. I mean, in some ways, Andrew, it's disappointing that we have to rely on private wealth to tackle these issues, but any wealth's better than none, of course. And, I mean, Bill Gates has just done wonders in this area and is to be hugely applauded.
And the reason that polio is a really good aim to fight against, apart from, obviously, it has devastating effects, is that you don't find polio in animals. So if you can get rid of it in people, then it is gone, and the same with smallpox. Whereas with malaria, or with other diseases, you can get it in animals as well.
And there's no political agenda. As with AIDS, for example, all these foundations have political agendas as well. But at least with things like smallpox and polio, it's pretty straightforward. It's a bad thing. Vaccination is a good thing.
That would be a fair assessment.
Yeah, but we did have a problem a few years ago in Pakistan when they thought that people were trying to vaccinate to get hold of DNA, and this is when they were trying to find Gaddafi. So obviously you haven't got that problem now. But you do still have, in some areas, they don't like the fact that their children are being given an American-based vaccine.
Nicola, Andrew, thank you very much indeed for joining us for this week's edition of Insight. Well, we end with our Insight Bite, a little something we feel that you should know. If you were lucky enough to see the Bosporus Strait this week in Turkey, you might have noticed it was an unusual colour. The normally dark waters of the sea were suddenly transformed into a brilliant shade of turquoise. Scientists say the anomaly is caused by an increase in phytoplankton, a microscopic marine algae which floats towards the surface on sunny days. Some residents were worried the water had become polluted. However, scientists say the phenomena is, in fact, completely natural. That's all for now. That was Insight.